Today we're going to talk about something a lot of companies do, but not many do well: IT outsourcing. We're going to demystify the whole process and lay out a clear roadmap for getting it right.
Okay, let's just dive right in, because the numbers here are pretty eye-opening. A huge 40% of outsourcing deals are just doing okay, and another 15% are flat-out performing poorly. Think about that. Only a tiny fraction, just 20%, actually hit that best-in-class mark where they're delivering real business value. So yeah, the stakes are incredibly high.
So that leads to the million-dollar question, right? When the odds are literally stacked against you, how do you make sure your deal is a success? How do you end up in that top 20%?
Well, the answer is having a structured, repeatable process. So today, we're going to walk through this 4-phase roadmap. We'll start with the blueprint. That's architect and engage. Then we'll get into the hard part, the operate and transition phase. And finally, we'll talk about the long game, manage and regenerate.
Here's the most important takeaway. Successful outsourcing isn't a one-and-done deal. It's a life cycle. And if you think of it that way, you'll have the framework you need to navigate all the complexities from start to finish, and then all over again.
So this life cycle breaks down into 4 really distinct phases. First, you architect the deal. Then you engage with a supplier. After that, you operate the service. And finally, you regenerate your strategy for whatever comes next. Each phase builds right on top of the last one.
Let's kick things off with those first 2 blueprint phases, architect and engage. This is all about the planning and prep work. You know, getting this part right is what sets the entire venture up for success down the road.
The architect phase, this is your foundation. This is how you avoid becoming just another doing okay statistic. It's about doing your homework up front. I mean, really investigating the market, targeting the exact right services to outsource, and designing a future that actually helps your business.
And you can see the real-world impact right here. One telecom company didn't have a clear plan for employee transfers, and it delayed their handover by 3 entire months. Now compare that to companies that do their homework. They can wrap up negotiations in just a few weeks. It's pretty simple. Planning pays off, big time. And this is just a perfect cautionary tale about what happens when you skip the design step. An airline had a good relationship with the supplier, so they just went with a handshake agreement. Well, years later, guess what? They found out they were being overcharged because none of the key service and pricing details were ever locked down.
Which brings us to the engage phase. This is where you avoid making that airline's mistake. It's all about picking the right partner, and this is critical, negotiating a contract that spells everything out. It protects your interests, but it also aims for a real win-win partnership.
You know, a fantastic tool for this is a prioritization system like this one. You've got to know your absolute deal breakers, your critical items, and separate them from the desired nice-to-haves. Having this kind of clarity just stops you from getting bogged down in the small stuff and keeps the negotiation focused on what actually matters.
Okay, so you've done the planning, you've signed the contract. Now comes the hard part, the operate phase. This is where the rubber meets the road, and honestly, it's where even a great deal can fall apart if that transition isn't managed perfectly.
And this moment is absolutely pivotal. The transition isn't just a simple handover, it's a fundamental power shift. The second that contract is signed and services start moving over, your biggest bargaining chip is gone. From here on out, success is all about managing the relationship.
So a structured transition is everything. Take ABN AMRO, for example. They had to transfer a massive number of applications, and they did it in waves. Each wave had 3 clear stages. First, a formal knowledge transfer. Second, the supplier's team would shadow the bank's staff. And finally, the supplier took over, with the bank's team observing. Super smart.
But look, a perfect process on paper is useless if you forget about your people. Transition isn't just about technology, it's about emotions. We have to manage that human journey, and it often starts with denial. That initial shock where people think, nah, this isn't really going to happen.
But then reality starts to sink in, and that denial can quickly turn into anger. And that's a totally natural reaction to uncertainty. But if you don't manage it, this stage can be incredibly destructive to morale and to the whole project.
From there, you'll probably see some bargaining. This is when employees start trying to find ways to avoid the change, maybe cut their own deal, just to feel like they have some control back.
Ultimately, the goal, with a ton of support and crystal clear communication, is to guide everyone toward acceptance. That's the point where they understand the change and can actually see where they fit in the new world. Managing this emotional roller coaster is just as critical as any technical step.
All right, this leads us to our final phases, which are all about the long game: manage and regenerate. The deal is live, the transition is done, and now the whole focus shifts to making sure it delivers value for years to come.
So, once everything's up and running, how do you actually make sure you're getting what you paid for? How do you manage performance day in and day out?
Well, it really comes down to a handful of key practices. And this isn't about micromanaging. It's about setting up a rhythm of regular meetings, both for the folks on the ground and for executives. It's about having the right to audit the data. And it's about using a smart mix of incentives and penalties to keep performance on track.
And that brings us to the final piece of this whole puzzle, the regenerate phase. Just because a contract is ending, it doesn't mean it's over. No, it's time to step back, look at what you achieved, learn the lessons, and figure out what's next.
And this brings us right back to the beginning. The life cycle starts all over again. All that knowledge you gained, what worked, what didn't, becomes the solid foundation for your next generation sourcing strategy. You just keep getting smarter with every single cycle.
So I'll just leave you with this one question to think about. Is your organization really building a strategic roadmap for success, or is it just focused on signing the next contract? Because the difference between those two approaches, well, that's what separates the best in class from everybody else.